Welcome, fellow crime and mystery enthusiasts, to Crime After Dark, where the unthinkable becomes reality and the sinister secrets are unveiled. If you're ready to take the chance of not being able to go to sleep tonight, then stay for the rest of the video and make sure to like and subscribe at the end. But hey, it's not all doom and gloom here. Amidst the intrigue and the evil, we'll share insights and maybe even crack a smile or two amidst the darkness. Because in a world where the unimaginable becomes reality, a little bit of lightness can be the key to sanity. So hit that subscribe button and prepare for an emotion-fueled roller coaster ride through the most mind-bending crimes imaginable. The guy we will be talking about in today's video is way more vicious and violent than the last killer in the last video, but don't be scared, he's not going to come and get you in the middle of the night. This guy has so many years in prison that he couldn't even hurt your great-grandchildren. Oh, by the way, if you haven't seen my last video, make sure you go check it out after you watch this one. Thank you in advance. Now let's get into today's psychopath, Gary Leon Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer. Gary Leon Ridgway, born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, the second child born to Mary and Thomas Ridgway's 3 sons. Gary's home life was somewhat troubled. Family members have described his mother as domineering and have said that, while a young boy, Gary had already witnessed more than a few violent arguments between his parents. Gary's father was a bus driver who would always complain about the presence of sex workers. Gary had a bad bedwetting issue, just like our killer in the last video. Gary wet the bed until he was 13 years old, and his mother would wash his genitals after every accident. He would later tell defense psychologists that, as an adolescent, he had feelings of anger and a sexual attraction toward his mother and fantasized about killing her. Gary is also dyslexic and was held back a year in high school. When Gary was 16, he stabbed a 6-year-old boy. It said the 16-year-old Gary led the little boy into the woods and then stabbed him through the ribs into his liver. Fortunately, the young boy survived the attack by Gary, but I'm sure it still haunts him to this day. Gary graduated from Tyee High School in 1969 and married his 19-year-old high school sweetheart, Claudia Craig. He then went on to join the United States Navy and was sent to Vietnam, where he served on board a supply ship and saw combat firsthand. While serving his time in the military, Gary had very frequent sexual intercourse with sex workers and ended up contracting gonorrhea. Although he was angered by this, Gary continued this type of activity without protection. Gary's marriage ended within a year. Not surprising if I do say so myself. When questioned about Gary after his arrest, friends and family described him as friendly but a little strange. His first 2 marriages resulted in divorce because of infidelities by both partners. His second wife, Marcia Winslow, claimed that he had put her in a chokehold and almost choking her out. Gary became very religious during his second marriage, proselytizing from door to door, reading the Bible aloud at work and at home, and insisting that his wife follow the strict teachings of their pastor. He would also cry after sermons or reading the Bible. Despite his beliefs, Gary continued to pay for the services of sex workers and also wanted his wife to participate in sex in public and inappropriate places, even in some of the areas where his victims' bodies were later discovered. According to the women in his life, Gary had a distasteful sexual appetite. His 3 ex-wives and several ex-girlfriends all said that he demanded sex from them several times a day. He would also want to have sex in public areas or in the woods, they said. Gary himself admitted to having a fetish with sex workers, with whom he had a love-hate relationship. He complained about their presence in his neighborhood, but he also desperately begged for their services regularly. In a statement read at his plea hearing, Gary Ridgway said he hated prostitutes and didn't want to pay them for sex. Some have speculated that Ridgway was torn between his lusts and his strong religious beliefs. All throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Gary is believed to have killed at least 71 teenage girls and women near Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. In statements made in court, Gary reported that he had killed so many women that he lost count of the actual number. Majority of the murders happened between 1982 and 1984. All his victims were said to be either sex workers or teenage runaways, whom he had picked up along Pacific Highway South. Gary also sometimes would show the women a picture of his son just to trick them into trusting him. They would engage in sexual activities, and after minutes of intercourse from behind, Gary would wrap his forearm around the front of his victims' necks and use his other arm to pull back as tight as he possibly could, ultimately strangling them to death. He killed most of his victims in his home, his truck, or a very secluded area. Most of their bodies were dumped in wooded areas around the Green River, Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, and other dump sites within South King County. There were also 2 confirmed and another 2 suspected victims found in the Portland, Oregon area as well. The bodies were often left in clusters, sometimes even posed, usually naked. He would sometimes return to his victims' bodies and have sexual intercourse with them again. Later, Gary explained that he did not find necrophilia more sexually satisfying, but having sex with the deceased reduced his need to obtain a living victim, and this limited his exposure to being caught. Because most of the bodies were not discovered until just the skeletons remained, 2 of his victims are still unidentified. Gary occasionally contaminated the dump sites of the bodies with gum, cigarettes, and written materials belonging to other people, and he even transported a few victims' remains across state lines into Oregon to confuse the police and investigators. In the early 1980s, the King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force to investigate the murders. Task Force members included Robert Keppel and Dave Reichert, who had periodically interviewed convicted serial killer Ted Bundy in 1984. Bundy offered his opinions on the psychology, motivations, and behavior of the killer. He informed police that the killer was revisiting the dump sites just to have sex with his victims, which turned out to be true, and if police happened to find a fresh grave, they should stake it out and wait for the killer to come back. Also helping local police with their investigation was FBI Special Agent John E. Douglas, who had developed a profile of the suspect. Gary was arrested in 1982 and 2001 on charges related to prostitution. He became a suspect in the Green River killings in 1983. In 1984, Gary passed a polygraph test. On April 7, 1987, police took hair and saliva samples from Gary. Around about the year 1985, Gary began dating a woman named Judith Mawson, who later became his 3rd wife in 1988. Mawson made claims in a 2010 television interview that when she moved into Gary's house while they were dating, there was no carpet anywhere in the house. Detectives later told her that Gary had probably wrapped a body up in the carpet. In that same interview, Mawson described Gary would leave for work really early in the morning some days. Gary claimed it was for the overtime pay. Mawson speculated that he must have committed some of the murders while supposedly working these super early morning shifts. She claimed that she had not suspected any of Gary's crimes before she was contacted by authorities in 1987. In fact, she claimed to have not even heard of the Green River Killer before that time because she never watched the news. Gary was interviewed while in prison by author Penny Moorhead, and he said while he was in the relationship with Mawson, his kill rate actually went down, and that he truly loved her. Of Gary's 49 known victims, only 3 women were killed after he married Mawson. Mawson said to a television reporter, "I feel I have saved lives by being his wife and making him happy." The samples gathered in 1987 were later subjected to DNA profiling, providing the evidence for Gary's arrest warrant. On November 30, 2001, Gary was at the Kenworth truck factory, where he worked as a spray painter, when police arrived to arrest him. Gary was arrested on suspicion of murdering 4 women nearly 20 years earlier after being identified as a potential suspect, when the DNA evidence conclusively linked semen left in the victims to the saliva swab taken by the police. The 4 victims named in the original indictment were Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen. 3 more victims, Wendy Caulfield, Deborah Bonner, and Deborah Estes, were added to the indictment after a forensic scientist identified microscopic paint spheres as a specific brand and composition of paint used at the Kenworth factory during the specific time frame when these victims were killed. Early August 2003, Seattle News reported that Gary had been moved from a maximum security jail cell at King County Jail to an Airway Heights minimum medium security level tank. Other news reports stated that his lawyers, who were led by Anthony Savage, were closing a plea bargain that would spare Gary the death penalty in return for his confession to the actual number of the Green River murders. On November 5, 2003, Gary entered his guilty plea to 48 charges of aggravated first-degree murder as part of a plea bargain agreed to in June that would spare Gary's execution in exchange for his cooperation in locating the remains of his victims and providing other details as well. In Gary's statement accompanying his guilty plea, he explained that he had killed all of his victims inside of King County, Washington, and that he had transported and dumped the remains of the 2 women near Portland just to confuse the police. Deputy Prosecutor Jeffrey Baird noted in court that the deal contained the names of 41 victims who would not be the subject of State v. Ridgway if it were not for the plea agreement. King County. Prosecuting attorney Norm Maleng gave reason on his decision to make the deal. We could have gone forward with 7 counts, but that is all we could have ever hoped to solve. At the end of that trial, whatever the outcome, there would have been lingering doubts about the rest of these crimes. This agreement was the avenue to the truth, and in the end, the search for the truth is still why we have a criminal justice system. Gary Ridgway does not deserve our mercy. He does not deserve to live. The mercy provided by today's resolution is directed not at Ridgway, but toward the families who have suffered so much. On December 18, 2003, King County Superior Court Judge Richard Jones sentenced Gary Ridgway to 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole to be served consecutively. Gary was also sentenced to an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence for each of the 48 victims, adding another 480 years to his 48 life sentences. Later, he was given another life sentence after the remains of his 49th victim were found. Gary Ridgway led prosecutors to 3 bodies in 2003. On August 16th of that same year, the remains of a 16-year-old girl found near Enumclaw, Washington, only 40 feet from State Route 410, were pronounced as belonging to Pammy Annette Avant, who police believed to be a victim of the Green River Killer. The remains of Marie Malvar and April Buttram were both found in September 2003. November 23, 2005, the Associated Press reported that a hiker had found the skull of one of the 48 women Gary had admitted to murdering in his 2003 plea bargain with King County prosecutors. The skull of another victim, Tracy Winston, who was 19 when she disappeared from Northgate Mall on September 12, 1983, was found on November 20, 2005, by a man hiking in a wooded area near Highway 18 near Issaquah, southeast of Seattle. This was the find that led to Gary's 49th life sentence. In 2023, remains formerly known as Bones 17, discovered in 1985, were identified, belonging to murder victim Lori Ann Raspotnik, who had disappeared from Seattle back in 1982. Gary Ridgway confessed to more confirmed murders than any other American serial killer in history. In over a period of 5 months of police and prosecutor interviews, he confessed to 48 murders, 42 of which were on the police's list of Green River Killer victims. On February 9, 2004, county prosecutors began to release the videotaped records of Gary's confessions. In one taped interview, he initially told investigators that he was responsible for the deaths of about 65 women. In another taped interview with Reichert on December 31, 2003, Gary claimed to have murdered 71 victims and confessed to having had sex with them before killing them, a detail which he did not reveal until after his sentencing. In Gary's confession, he acknowledged that he targeted prostitutes because they were easy to pick up and that he hated most of them. He confessed that he had sex with his victims' bodies after he murdered them, but claimed he began burying his later victims so that he could resist the urge to commit necrophilia. Gary Ridgway later said that murdering young women was his career. Gary was placed in solitary confinement at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla in January 2004. On May 14, 2015, he was transferred to the USP Florence High, a high-security federal prison east of Cajun City, Colorado. In September 2015, after a public outcry and discussions with Governor Jay Inslee, Corrections Secretary Bernie Warner announced that Gary would be transferred back to Washington to be easily accessible for any open murder investigations. Gary was returned by a chartered plane to Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla from USP Florence High on October 24, 2015. Before Gary Ridgway's confession, authorities had attributed 49 murders to the Green River Killer. Gary Ridgway had confessed to murdering at least 71 victims. His victims were not of any specific race or ethnicity. They were all just financially poor, and all but 3 of them were all younger women and girls between the ages of 14 and 26, whom he found in vulnerable circumstances, often working as prostitutes, or they ran away from home. Well, that's going to just about wrap this one up, folks. Make sure, if you liked this video, you give that like button a little tap before leaving. Also, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications. That way, you never miss a video. I would also love to hear you guys' feedback, so make sure you visit that comment section and tell me, what was your take on this video? Love you guys and see you in the next one.